Hi, this is Brad Linder with Liliputing, and this is Dell's 2018 XPS 13 thin and light laptop. It's got an updated design over some of the earlier models, and it comes in two different color options, black and silver, or rose gold and white, which is the version that Dell loaned me for purposes of this review. I've been testing it for the last couple of weeks, and there's really quite a bit to like about this thin and light notebook that sells for about $1,000 and up. There are definitely a couple of quirks that take some getting used to and might make it not the best option for everybody, but first let's focus on some of the things that are really pretty great about this laptop. As I mentioned, it is thin and light. It weighs about 2.7 pounds, measures about half an inch thick. It's got a updated cooling system, which includes sort of dual fans and dual heat pipes under the hood, and overall, it runs pretty close to silently most of the time when I'm using it. The fans do kick in when you're doing things like gaming or video transcoding or sort of heavy-duty tasks, but it cools down relatively quickly, so you're not going to hear those fans all the time. When you do hear them, they're a little bit noisy, but overall, I'm not disappointed by the level of fan noise. The design, it's got some of the slimmest bezels that you're likely to find on a laptop, and those little flashing lights are because it supports facial recognition login. So we've got these slim bezels, which give it a very sort of nice design. That's something that Dell's been doing on its XPS 13 and 15 laptops for a while, but they're even slimmer now at about 4 millimeters thick. And that means that for the most part, the screen takes up most of the front of the device. We've got a larger bezel down here on the bottom, and overall Dell says you get about an 80% screen to body ratio. In terms of performance, this configuration that I tested has a Core i5-8250 quad-core Kaby Lake refresh processor. That's an 8th generation Intel quad-core chip, 8 gigabytes of RAM, and 256 gigs of PCIe NVMe storage. Very speedy storage for the most part, and overall performance is pretty great. This is the first Kaby Lake refresh laptop that I've tested. Performance, from what I've seen in terms of benchmarks, is pretty much on par with what you would expect from a Core 5 8th generation chip on other devices. And that is better than anything else that I've tested in terms of 7th gen, 6th gen, 5th gen core processors. It does a better job with synthetic benchmarks, it transcodes videos faster, audio faster, and generally it's pretty speedy and pretty responsive. So I have no real complaints in terms of performance. The design is also kind of nice for the most part. So this is available in two different finishes. As I mentioned, we've got here the rose gold version, which has a CNC aluminum back and bottom. And this is actually a new material that Dell has introduced for this model, which is a glass fiber composite. So you get carbon fiber for the black model, and on the white model you get this glass fiber. If you listen, you can hear there's a little bit of texture. You don't really feel it when you're holding your palm down and typing, but you can sort of feel a little bit of a woven texture. And if we zoom in a little bit, maybe you can see what that looks like here. It's feels pretty nice. It's warm. It doesn't feel cold or hot the way that metal usually does. And the metal on the bottom of the machine only really gets warm under extended use. I've used this for hours of web browsing and web work, which is sort of what I do for a living, and it doesn't necessarily get hot. Gaming does make it warm up a little bit. So now let's talk about some of the quirks that I mentioned. There are a couple of things that are kind of interesting to note about this laptop. One is that because it's so thin and light, there's no room for full-sized Ethernet, HDMI, or even USB ports. We've got 3 ports here. There's 2 Thunderbolt 3 ports, which are USB Type-C, and 1 USB 3.1 Type-C port, a headset jack, and a micro SD card slot. There's not a full-sized SD card slot. There's not a full-size USB port. And what that means is that if you wanted to plug in something like, say, a USB flash drive, you're probably going to need an adapter unless you've got a USB Type-C flash drive. We don't quite live in a world where everything is USB Type-C compatible yet, though. So Dell does include this single adapter, but if you wanted to plug in a keyboard, a mouse, an external display, printer, all sorts of different things, if you're going to use a wired connection, you're going to need this or other types of adapters. If you wanted to plug in a display, you're going to need some sort of HDMI adapter, for instance. So what you wind up with is a very sleek-looking machine until you start plugging things in, and then you wind up with a machine that looks a little bit clunkier, like that. So that's one quirk It's not a huge issue if you don't plug a lot of things in, and the fact that it does come with an adapter is helpful, I suppose. We've got stereo speakers here on the side, which are not the loudest, but for a 13-inch laptop, they're not bad. And they're not on the bottom, so they don't obscure the sound. Nothing sounds muffled if you put it on your lap. You can open up the case. I wasn't able to do that because I don't have the right kind of screwdriver. It uses these hex screws instead of Phillips head screws. My understanding is that the RAM is not user replaceable, but the storage is. So you're probably going to want to avoid the entry-level model. It has only 4 gigabytes of RAM because it just doesn't seem like it's worth spending $1,000 on a laptop to get only 4 gigabytes. But it is available with 8 gigabytes or 16 gigabytes if you opt for the higher priced models. We've got 4 mics on the front and a status indicator. And one of the things that's actually kind of cool about this USB setup is that if you use the USB Type-C power adapter, you can actually plug it into any of the ports and charge the laptop that way. So let me go ahead and plug in the power adapter. Obviously farther away than it should have been. Unwind the cable a little bit. And I'll show you that we've got a little glowing light there. Plug it in, and we should have a little glowing light here. We can try plugging it into any of the ports, and it should work just fine. So that's a nice little advantage of the USB Type-C ports, is the fact that it charges via them. As you might have seen before, you can log in with facial recognition. There's also a fingerprint scanner built into the power button. So if I turn it on again, don't look at it, but use my fingerprint, I can log in that way. Facial recognition works pretty well, but you also might have noticed that the cameras are located below the screen. And that's because this device doesn't have enough bezel size, really, for cameras on the top. That's not a problem if you don't use the camera very much, but if you do, you wind up with sort of this awkward angle. So if you start trying to type, you're gonna get your fingers in the shot. And if you look directly at the camera, you sort of wind up with these unflattering angles. So the camera position is something that Dell's been doing on its XPS 13 laptops for a while. It's not my favorite thing about these laptops. It is better than not having a camera at all. And Dell's calculus here is basically that most people don't use the camera that much. But you'll notice my line of sight, if I'm looking at myself here, I'm looking up, and I'm sort of getting a nice shot of my nose here. If the laptop's closer to me, it's going to look even more problematic there. So for video chat, you might want to plug in an external camera. If you just wanted to take a quick picture, it's fine. And it works reasonably well most of the time when you're using it for the Windows Hello Secure logins, assuming that you have the screen open far enough for the camera to shoot up at you. If you don't, I'll show you what happens. So I'm looking right at it and nothing. I'm going to tilt it up a little bit and we can log in. So personally, I've used the fingerprint sensor as a login method more often. Just looking through my list of notes, other things that I wanted to talk about here. Right. Another quirk that takes a little bit of getting used to is we've got a backlit keyboard here. Now, this isn't an issue on the black model, I don't think, but if you get the white version, you've got a backlit keyboard that I honestly think when the keys are lit, it can be a little harder to see what's going on. So with the lights off, you got sort of white keys with black background. With the light on, that light shines through and can make it a little bit harder to see, I think. So I've actually preferred using this with the backlighting turned off for the most part. Another thing is I mentioned that there's 4 microphones on the front, and that's because it does support Hey Cortana voice recognition, which I found can be a little bit hit or miss sometimes. Hey Cortana. Hey Cortana. Make sure it's turned on. It is. Hey Cortana. Hey Cortana. Hey Cortana. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Hey Cortana. What's the temperature in Philadelphia? So it can be a little hit or miss, even though it's got those quad microphones. When it's listening, it seems to work fine. It's not great with the voice detection, and it's supposed to support far-field voice detection. That's part of the reason why there's 4 microphones. I found that while Dell says it should be able to pick up your voice from up to 14 feet away, any more than 7 feet away, it sort of has a difficult time picking up a Hey Cortana hot word. And as you can see, sometimes it just doesn't pick it up at all. Hey Cortana. And sometimes it does. So in terms of sort of those special features, the Windows Hello login for the fingerprint sensor works great. Windows Hello login using facial recognition works great as long as the camera is well positioned. And the Hey Cortana feature is a little hit or miss at times. So in general, I like the design, I like the performance. It gets up to 8 to 10 hours of battery life, which is a little short of the 19 hours of unrealistic battery life that Dell claims in its promotional materials, but pretty good for day-to-day use. Because the battery is not user replaceable, you have to assume that in 2-3 years of regular usage, you're not going to get the full 8 to 10 hours, so you want to start off with something that gets pretty good battery life, and this model does. It's got a nice display. This version that I'm testing actually has a 1920 by 1080 pixel display. It's also available with up to a 4K touchscreen display. That model is actually going to get shorter battery life. So that one of the reasons why when Dell asked me if I'd rather test a 1080p or a 4K version, I said 1080p is because I wanted to see what kind of battery life you're going to get from this version, which on a 13.3-inch display, I mean, 4K looks great, but so does 1080p, to be perfectly honest. It's not a matte display, so you do get a little bit of glare when you sort of point it at lights. It's got an anti-glare coating, so it's a little bit less than it could be under some other situations, but it's still not really designed for outdoor use. It does have 178 degree viewing angles, and it's not a touchscreen. One thing that I do find a little problematic is that Dell doesn't offer a 1080p touchscreen option. If you want the touchscreen, you have to spend a bundle more because you're getting that 4K screen and the touchscreen bundled together, and you get less battery life. So for my money, I think that this version is probably better. Overall, as I mentioned, the keyboard backlight is a little bit problematic, but the keyboard travel works pretty nicely. I don't have any problems typing on this keyboard. So for touch typists, I think it's a pretty reliable experience. The touchpad has a nice smooth surface to it, supports multi-touch gestures, 2-finger scrolling, 3-finger gestures, and so forth. And the only other thing that I find a little bit weird here is the layout of the home and end keys, which are up here in the function row next to delete and F12. It's a little strange to have them so far away from the page up, page down, and the arrow keys. I think that's mostly because they Dell probably wanted to put the function brightness keys into some place that was fairly easy for you to find them. But it's a little bit weird that when you want to sort of go forward, back, home, you have to remember to move your hand all the way to the top of the screen. Not a deal breaker, especially if it's the sort of thing that you get used to over time. But in terms of sort of where the layout of those keys is, it's not my favorite layout, and especially switching back and forth between multiple computers, almost every time I start using this one, I have to stop and think for a second before I hit home or end. We've got function keys here up in the top that do include volume, backlighting. There's a nice little sort of, I guess nothing's actually running right now, but there's the option to sort of go to the Windows task view here. And I guess one thing that I often do here that I didn't do this time is show you a video. That's the wrong Brad Linder. You'd think I'd remember my channel. And let's do a little... This reminds me, as we look at Ubuntu running on the GPD Win laptop, I did test this with Ubuntu Linux, and it loads just fine. Dell actually offers this laptop with an optional Ubuntu Linux install instead of Windows. And so you know everything's going to work pretty well if you get the version that comes with it preloaded. They don't offer that image for download, but I just downloaded a stock Ubuntu 16.04 disk image, loaded it onto a USB flash drive, booted it, and everything worked just fine. Audio, video, keyboard shortcuts, and so forth. So it works pretty nicely. So overall, pretty nice laptop. couple of quirks in terms of the keyboard, the display, the webcam, and a couple of other things. But overall, I think it's a winner. So that's the Dell XPS 13 2018 edition. You can find more details at liliputing.com.